Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Charleston Literary Festival. I'm Diana Reich, founder and currently Senior Artistic Advisor of the festival, and I'm truly delighted to present this session's speakers, distinguished and world-renowned Harvard political philosopher Michael Sandel, furthest from me, talking to Geoffrey Harpham, who many of you already know, Emeritus Director of the National Humanities Center, and author of Citizenship on Catfish Row, amongst other work, whose forthcoming book will be called The Ends of Race, The Rise and Fall of a Concept. And I'd also like to express my profound gratitude to the sponsor for this event, Kay Bachman. I hope you're in the audience, Kay. Michael Sandel's books, Democracy's Discontent and The Tyranny of Merit, Can We Find the Common Good, could not be more pertinent for our times, both nationally and internationally. Tuesday's election results highlight discontent and leave us on the cusp of a consequential political transition. On the global scene, long-standing political allegiances are in disarray. The concept of democracy, which emanates from ancient Greece and stems from the word demos, meaning people, is constantly invoked. That's constantly invoked. And the imperative to strive for the common good was also born in ancient Greece. But what do these noble aspirations signify and entail in our current tumultuous world? There could be no one more qualified than Professor Michael Sandel to help to enlighten us at the Charleston Literary Festival, where respectful debate and conversations stemming from important books, where tolerance of differences of opinion are considered, are at the core of our mission. So I'm delighted to hand over to Geoffrey Harpham to start the conversation.
Well, it's fortuitous indeed to have Michael Sandel here at this place on this date. I'm sure that, like everybody else, Michael, you have been reading commentary after the election, and it seems to me that a world of commentary breaks like a saltine or something into two schools. The first school says, this is astonishing, I never expected this, all my ideas are wrong, I know nothing about reality, I'm completely gobsmacked, and I don't know how to grasp this at all. And the second side says, nothing here surprises me. Which side are you on?
The second.
Maybe you'd like to expand on that.
Well, before I describe why I'm in the second camp, it reminds me of a story some in the audience may remember. The film critic for The New Yorker in the 1960s, Pauline Kael, you remember her?
Sure.
And in 1972, Richard Nixon won in a landslide, defeating George McGovern. And Pauline Kael was surprised, and she said, "Nobody I know votes for Nixon." And that, in a way, that element of surprise, I think, speaks to to ships passing in the night in our politics.
And firing at each other.
Yes. Yeah. I think the election of Donald Trump, round 2, shows that the discontents that have been rumbling, first beneath the surface and then in full view in American public life, have not been put to rest. And that's fundamentally why I wasn't surprised. Democracy's Discontent came out in the mid-1990s when we were all celebrating the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Liberal democratic capitalism of the American variety seemed to be the only system left standing. It was a triumphalist moment, but just beneath the surface, it seemed to me there were growing discontents about the condition of American self-government, which were basically two deep strains of discontent. First, a growing sense that we're less and less in control of the forces that govern our lives, individually and collectively. People felt their voices didn't matter. And today, if anything, that worry has deepened. 85% now tell pollsters that their voice doesn't matter. The people who govern don't care about what people like me think. The second strain of discontent was the anxiety that the moral fabric of community, from family to neighborhood to country, nation, was unraveling. People felt dislocated. And so I think there was a kind of hunger for community and a fear that the moral fabric that holds us together was unraveling. And this, too, I think, has deepened. Our politics hasn't successfully addressed either. And by the time of 2016, when Donald Trump was elected the first time, when the shock was greater for many people, because I think there was a lot of complacence, especially among elites. The governing elites, academic elites, media elites, didn't really take seriously that the way they had been governing or thinking about public life was leaving a lot of people behind economically, but more than that, was leading a lot of people feeling looked down upon by those elites. And the deepest source of Donald Trump's appeal is that he's able to tap into the grievances of people who feel that elites are looking down. That is the centerpiece of his politics, of grievance. And the Democrats made a mistake to think that they had managed to either address those grievances or somehow put them to rest.
You speak about a way of thinking that is at fault here. Could you describe that?
Well, it's a way of thinking and also a way of governing that go together. The way of thinking is that what democracy is really about is securing a certain kind of freedom. And democracy's discontent is really about competing strands of freedom, but the dominant way of thinking about freedom is the idea that the job of politics is to create a structure of rights that enable people to pursue their own ends, whatever they may be, consistent with a similar liberty for others. That's the fundamental ideal of a certain version of liberal freedom. What it misses is a further dimension of freedom, what might be called the civic dimension of freedom, that says we're not free only when we can get what we want in the marketplace or as consumers. True freedom requires that we engage with fellow citizens in deliberating about the common good in a way that matters to how we're governed. So to be free in the civic sense is to have a meaningful say in shaping the forces that govern our lives. And what's happened, I think, over the last 50, 60 years is that civic understanding of freedom, sharing in self-rule, and that requires a sense of community. It requires the ability to deliberate, including with those with whom we disagree. That's been crowded out by a rival consumerist idea of freedom that's highly individualistic and that doesn't really speak either to community or to the aspiration to have a meaningful say together about how we shall be governed.
You know, the plasticity of the term freedom is highlighted by your work, I think. It can mean so many different things,
Yeah.
and even diametrically opposed things.
Yeah.
But what you describe in Democracy's Discontent is an older view of
Yeah.
freedom that involved a morally coherent and morally cohesive community.
Yes.
And then there's a more recent, post-Cold War view of freedom that's predicated on individual choice and autonomy, and the government is neutral with respect to ends.
Yes.
And you don't like that idea of the government neutral with respect to ends, do you?
Right. I think I don't. And you're right to connect this to a morally more robust way of thinking about freedom. Because on this older civic understanding of freedom, politics in part is a project of civic education. It's about cultivating our character, including our civic virtue, which now seems like a somewhat antiquated ideal, civic virtue. But I'd like to see if we can't revive it and make it relevant to contemporary times. Because if government gives up, I should say if public life altogether gives up, on the idea of cultivating common purposes and ends, the moral dimension of freedom, and instead says, well, we're not going to bother with that. We're going to simply seek a structure of rights that's neutral with respect to conceptions of the good life. Well, there are two problems with that. First, it isn't really possible to resolve our biggest public disagreements in a way that's neutral with regard to competing conceptions of the good life. The closest we come, or so we've told ourselves, has been to say, well, we'll empower markets to resolve questions about how to value goods and social roles. And this explains, I think, the market faith that has so animated public discourse on the right and the left in recent decades. It's not only the belief. Well, let's take a step back to the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher came in saying explicitly, government is the problem and free markets are the solution. They articulated directly, openly, and provocatively,
And successfully.
a bracing notion, individualistic, market-based notion of freedom. But even when they were succeeded by center-left political parties and politicians, Bill Clinton in the United States, Tony Blair in Britain, they never really challenged the fundamental premise of the market faith. They never challenged the idea that market mechanisms are the primary instruments for defining and achieving the public good. They softened the harsh edges of a pure laissez-faire market society. But they never challenged that fundamental premise. And as a result, they embraced a market-based, finance-driven version of globalization, which some called a neoliberal version of globalization. They deregulated the financial industry, for example. And the effect was widening inequalities, jobs outsourced to low-wage countries with few protections for labor or the environment, wage stagnation, which for the average worker, wages were stagnant. There was no real increase in wages on average for about 5 decades. Meanwhile, those governing elites, and this includes Democrats and Republicans, said, if you're worried about wage stagnation and your job being outsourced, the solution is go get a university degree, go to college. They said, you remember these slogans, what you earn will depend on what you learn. If you want to compete and win in the global economy, go to college. You can make it if you try.
And if you don't?
Well, that's just it. And if you don't, what they missed was the insult implicit in that bracing advice. If you don't have a degree, and if you're struggling in the new economy, the implication is your failure is your fault. It's not that we put in place economic arrangements that created rising inequality. It's that you didn't improve yourself the way we told you to. Well,
the way we warned you to.
Warned you to. And so it's no wonder that a great many working people were left angry and resentful, especially when the financial crisis came and Democrats and Republicans alike bailed out the banks, did not hold Wall Street to account, and left ordinary homeowners to fend for themselves and to confront a decade of austerity. So it's no wonder that this anger and resentment has been brewing and deepening from beginning in the 80s up through the 90s and early 2000s.
You know, markets produce winners and, of course, losers. And I think one thing that you anatomize so powerfully is that the losers really feel the disrespect because of what you call the tyranny of the idea of merit.
Right.
They feel that they are judged to be without merit because merit is calibrated only on one single scale of economic success.
Yes.
And I think that this analysis, that the issue of respect is a powerful political force, is about to come into full fruition. I noticed that both Bret Stephens and your friend David Brooks yesterday, when they were doing their election postmortems, identified the issue of respect as being something that's completely missing. The Democratic side, I think, they said an almost total failure of respect for the Republican side, which lo and behold turned out to be the majority.
Yes, and there's an interesting reversal here as between the parties. If you look at the results from this election, you see and you look at the deepest cleavage, the most decisive gap in how different groups voted. There's a lot of attention paid during this election, understandably, to the gender gap, which was sizable. But bigger than the gender gap was the diploma gap. The votes of those with and without a four-year college degree, who overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump. Now, in 2016, white voters without a college degree voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, and those with degrees, and especially advanced degrees, voted for Hillary Clinton. In this election, that trend continued to include not only white voters without a college degree, but also Latino and African American voters without a college degree, migrating away from the Democratic Party toward the Republican Party. So the diploma divide is perhaps the single deepest divide in our politics today, and it's connected to what I describe as the tyranny of merit, which for audiences like ours, it seems strange to think that merit could be a kind of tyranny. Merit is a good thing, isn't it? I mean, if I need an appendectomy, I want a well-qualified surgeon to perform it. That's merit. Merit is good, so how can merit be a kind of tyranny? It goes, what you were saying, Geoffrey, to the divide between winners and losers. The divide between rich and poor, which we were discussing, or between those who gained most from globalization and those left behind, that's an economic thing. That's the neoliberal globalization produced the divide between the rich and the poor. But the tyranny of merit, credentialed elites looking down on those without degrees, the failure of respect, is what produced the divide between winners and losers. And that's not only economic, that's also cultural.
When I read your work, it seems to me that you stress the kind of conceptual or the affective, the attitudinal factors more than you do the economic factors. In other words, you don't stress the economic divide as producing aggravation and contempt on both sides. You stress the respect divide. Is that fair to say?
Yes, at least I'm trying to suggest that that's what matters most ultimately, and what we tend to overlook, because we're familiar with debates. You know, it goes back, James Carville, who managed Bill Clinton's campaign, his famous slogan was, "It's the economy, stupid. Focus on the economy and you will prevail." That was the advice he gave Bill Clinton, and it seemed...
But what's difficult about this is that while you can imagine restructuring the economy to give people more money, it's very difficult to imagine restructuring an entire suite of, or ensemble of attitudes and...
Well, we'd better figure out how to do that, because it's... And here's where the economic issues and cultural issues are connected. Commentators often debate, is it the economy or is it the culture wars that are really decisive, including in animating support for Donald Trump? I think that divide is too sharply drawn, because the way we organize the economy shapes the attitudes, to go to the term, Geoffrey, the attitudes, and in this case, respect and also dignity that public life cultivates. And what's truly galling is when you're not only left behind economically, because that's just a matter of the wrong policies, economic policy, but when that economic divide, when insult is added to the injury of economic struggle, the insult being that those who flourish, those who succeed, inhale too deeply of their own success, come to believe that their success is their own doing, and by implication, that those who struggle must deserve their fate too. And this is the failure of respect. And now, what would it mean to shift that? Well, part of it is to shift our public discourse from a debate about how to equip people to compete, to scramble up a ladder of success, even as the rungs are growing further and further apart, to shift from meritocratic competition as the primary political project to a political agenda about the dignity of work. What would it mean to make life better for everyone who contributes to the economy and to the common good through the work they do, the families they raise, the communities they serve, whether or not they have a college degree?
And you often speak as if the onus is on the elites to change their attitudes, to change their behavior. But the elites are now no longer the political elite. In other words, the power is with the other side.
They're having been displaced, you mean?
That's right.
Yes.
And do you think in a couple of years' time it will be the elites who will be crying out for more respect than they're getting, and they're not getting any? And where will you be then on that debate? Because you'll be on the disrespected wrong side.
Well, never underestimate the tendency of elites, even when they're riding high, of feeling they deserve even more. In fact, Max Weber was onto this 100 years ago when he said the successful want not only to enjoy the fruits of their success, they also want to believe that they deserve their success, and that they deserve their success as a kind of triumph over those who struggle. Now, Max Weber, when he was onto this, but for him, he was trying to explain those who believed that they were destined for salvation, because the early debates about merit and success, going back to the the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism and Calvinist predestination, that whole story, was who will be saved? And can I be saved through my good works, my doing, my merit? Is salvation a matter of merit? So it becomes a source of pride, a source of hubris. And if you come to believe that you are among the elect, you're not likely to have a very generous disposition toward those other folks. And if success, worldly success, is a marker, an indicator of who has been destined for salvation, then it's pretty potent.
There's a headline in the Times that says today that the Christian nationalists who supported Trump are now looking to a government that has God as its final authority.
Well,
And so
they're in good company historically.
Yeah.
This idea goes back a long way. And from the standpoint of the successful, the hubris of the successful, looking down on
What I'm
those-
pointing out, though, is that the group of people who are successful
Yes.
has now shifted radically, just flipped.
You mean as of this election?
That's right.
Well, yes and no. Politically, yes. Now, whether that will come to reshape the culture and attitudes toward who's really on top, that remains to be seen, I think.
Don't you think power would be an even more attractive prospect than the respect of the elites for those who are not elite? Don't you think they'd rather have power than my respect? What do they need? They've got plenty of self-respect. They've got power.
You're talking about those who are now ascendant after the election. Do you mean?
That's right. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting if you listen. I'm not so sure. Because if you listen to the rhetoric of Donald Trump about elites, when he talks about elites, of course he castigates the media and academic elites and even Wall Street, in moments, Wall Street elites. But he also, at the same time, craves respect and craves the respect of the elites. And so he tells his audience, actually, we're the elites. And he assures us, remember, especially in 2016, this time too, how very smart he is, and that he was a very stable genius. So it's a kind of reaching. So just winning an election is not enough. It's not enough, surprisingly. It's a reaching for the sources of respect that are almost built into the hierarchy of esteem that he rails against. It's kind of so winning political office and power is not a sufficient condition for winning that kind of esteem.
No, the Trump phenomenon is endlessly interesting, but your work, I think, provides a particularly acute angle of analysis because you describe two ways of thinking. The liberal way, which is just procedural, it's focused on prosperity, individual choice, perfect freedom, neutral towards and morally neutral.
Yes.
And then the civic Republican way, which involves a morally cohesive community, people living in significant contact. And it seems that Trump is the embodiment of the liberal way of thinking, morally neutral or amoral, focused only on his own choices, and success is kind of easily measured, and yet his supporters formed themselves as a morally cohesive community.
Well, it's a very interesting way you've put it, Geoffrey, because it's true. His dominant rhetoric, self-presentation, orientation is very much drawn from the liberal individualist conception of success, defined in large part by market success, even selling sneakers and watches in the middle of a campaign. So that's true, and yet the grievances and anxieties that his politics appeals to, including on the issue of immigration and the border, draws upon a hunger for community and membership and belonging. I think that the potence of the immigration issue, including for voters who live far from any border where immigrants are coming in. The potence of the immigration issue, I think, is not that people actually believe his florid rhetoric about criminals and insane asylum residents pouring over. It's not that. It's the sense that a country, this goes back to the sense of disempowerment we were talking about before, a country that can't control its border can't control its destiny and doesn't really care more for its own citizens than for strangers. So there is, I think, underneath the angry rhetoric about borders and immigrants, there is a hunger, a yearning for a stronger sense of community, shared identity, belonging, a country that cares for its own citizens so that it doesn't send jobs overseas to low-wage countries, but cares about what happens in industrial communities in the Midwest and elsewhere. That it not only allows a surge of immigrants, that stands for a yearning for a country that cares for its own. That's what America First, in a way, through a glass darkly, expresses. And I think it's been a mistake for liberals to neglect patriotism and to consign patriotism to, oh, that's something that the right wing talks about. That's what the intolerant right-wing people talk about, patriotism. Because that seeds one of the most important moral and civic sources of identity and belonging and of freedom to a very narrow reading of what it means to share a common life.
And a shallow.
And shallow. And so instead, rather than to say, no, well, talk about patriotism, that makes us kind of uneasy, that's for them, that's what they say. Instead, I think liberals and progressives and Democrats should articulate their own conception of what we owe one another as fellow citizens. Because if progressives want a more generous mode of sharing and dealing with economic prosperity, they're going to have to articulate what it is we share as Americans and what it is we owe one another as fellow citizens. And that means they need an account of patriotism, not to repeat and to replicate the Trumpian version of that, but to offer an alternative. And I think likewise with respect to the dignity of work. What does that mean exactly?
You know, you cited actually a sentence from the editorial that you wrote recently in the New York Times when you said that a country that has lost control of its borders has lost control of its destiny. And that struck me because from time to time in your work, I encounter this term control. The hostage crisis that doomed the Carter administration seemed to confirm that a nation that was accustomed to mastery had lost control of its destiny, the same phrase. And one of the values of the Republican view is that it teaches that to be free is to share in a political community that controls its own fate. Obviously, the concept of control is very important to you. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, collective control. Because it's a mistake to think we can meaningfully shape the forces that govern our lives only as individuals, only as consumers, only as the bearers of individual rights. And so the control that I'm referring to there is the control that democratic citizens taken together can exercise toward the big economic forces that would otherwise govern our lives. And going way back into the American political tradition, the debate about economic arrangements it's always been in part about prosperity, but it's also been about citizenship, about creating an economy hospitable to democracy. And back at the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, that's what spawned the antitrust and anti-monopoly tradition. That was about democratic control of the economy so that large economic powers and forces, back then it was the railroads and the banks and the Standard Oil Company, so that they couldn't run roughshod over the people's will. In our day, antitrust has turned into a kind of consumer protection, a way of keeping prices down. That's the consumerist idea of freedom. And until recently, we forgot that it's also about holding economic power to democratic account. Now, today, the challenge is posed by the big economic power concentrated in the tech industry and in Silicon Valley. And can we develop a kind of political economy that holds accountable the enormous power to invent the direction of new technologies and AI, the enormous power that is now concentrated in the tech industry and in Silicon Valley? And now, that's partly a question of power, it's partly a question of how to configure the economy, but it's ultimately a question about citizenship. Are we really in control of the forces that govern our lives if, and this is especially for young people, if we're constantly staring at our screens, swiping and scrolling, unable to divert our attention from that screen? Well, why is that? It's because the business model of Facebook and Meta and Instagram, they figured out how to do that. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. That's a political question, whether we want our kids and our grandkids to be glued to a screen, even at family meals, or even when we're holding a conversation together, or even in my classroom where I've had to ban screens and cell phones if I'm to have any chance of capturing their attention.
There's one word in the response you just gave that particularly drew my attention, because I think it strikes deep into the kind of inner workings of your argument, your macro argument, and that was collective. You clearly favor or have a more positive view than many people do of that civic Republican community that is morally cohesive and that has morally robust conversations about the common values and common principles that bind us all together. But the liberal view was invented in order to counteract a dangerous tendency of that moral community to be, as you say, coercive. Yeah. And you do concede in this book that there can be bad communities that generate bad characters. And the oddity about our current polarized situation is that everybody on both sides would completely agree that the other side represents a bad community with bad characters. Right. So what if you found yourself, your dreams come true, you're in a morally cohesive community with the current political distribution, and you found yourself on the outs, excluded not only politically or economically, but excluded in a moral sense?
Right. I wouldn't like it, and that's why we have certain fundamental rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights that constrain what the majority can do, beginning with freedom of speech and religious liberty and other rights and liberties that are constitutionally protected, provided we can rely on the Supreme Court to uphold those rights. But
you point to an interesting issue.
Well, but the question is whether it's possible to define and defend even those individual rights in a way that is neutral with respect to fundamental moral questions. And here's where I think neutrality has led us astray. It's as if we, for fear of the coercion, if we bring values into politics, that the majority will impose on some the values they don't share. Right. For fear of that kind of majoritarian coercion, the tyranny of the majority, we tend to insist on the idea that public discourse should be neutral toward contested moral and spiritual conceptions, because that's where this danger will come in. And so it's as if we ask citizens to leave their moral and spiritual convictions outside when they enter the public square. I think this is a mistake. It's an understandable mistake because it's an attempt to stave off the risk of the tyranny of the majority imposing values. It's a mistake because it creates a moral vacuum in the public square and in our public discourse that sooner or later will be filled by narrow, intolerant moralisms of two kinds: religious fundamentalism or hypernationalism. And that's exactly what we've seen over the last 50 years. The attempt to banish substantive moral argument from public discourse out of good impulses to avoid the risk of majoritarian tyranny has so emptied public discourse and given it over to a kind of technocratic managerial way of thinking about public discourse that it's left this moral void. But moral voids in public life don't last for long. People want public life to be about large questions of meaning. And so it's been filled by narrow, intolerant moralisms of the kind that we've seen.
We've got just a couple of minutes left before we turn to questions, but I want to ask you about the particular role and opportunities open to elite universities in negotiating these forces, because they're filled with influencers, they're filled with opinion makers, people, deep thinkers, and people who have an outsized share of public attention directed to them. And how do you think that universities have done in recent years managing the public discourse, and what do you think they should do?
I don't think they've done very well. And I think the main failure has been that we have not done enough to cultivate among students the ability to reflect critically on their own moral and political convictions, which means engaging with some of the great moral and political philosophers of the past and figuring out how what they had to say bear on contemporary debates. We've not done a good enough job of cultivating in students the ability to contend with disagreement, to reason together about hard, ethically charged civic questions with civility and mutual respect, but substantively, defending and articulating their view, persuading and sometimes being persuaded by engaging with those with whom they disagree. We've not done a good enough job of doing that. Higher education, if it's truly to be higher, means it has to be more than basic training for a technocratic managerial society. Because if that's what we're doing, we're not preparing young people to be democratic citizens. So we need to do a better job of, now students report that they feel intimidated, that they feel like they can't voice
by
views.
Each other.
What's that?
By each other.
Yes, and by the general atmosphere. And so there's the tendency then to go to complain to the administration if somebody said something that I find offensive. Instead, we should empower students to have a debate, to contend with those views that they find disagreeable, and to reason together and argue together about big questions that matter. That's one of the most important missions, I think, of higher education. It's the civic purpose of the university. I taught for many years a course on justice, and then we put it online, made it freely available. That is a course in this kind of civic undertaking. When it went online, too many of the students had watched it before they came, and so I stopped teaching it in person and let it live online, and lots of people have looked at it around the world. Whether or not they go to Harvard, anyone can see it. It's free. That was the whole idea. But in the wake of this sense that we've lost the ability on campuses, students have lost the ability to really think through their moral and civic convictions and to argue with one another. I brought it back this semester, and we do take on the most ethically fraught questions in the company of philosophers of the past. And students are hungry for this kind of engagement. And they can do it, given the chance. They can do it with civility and respect, and yet without censoring themselves and without feeling intimidated. It's a project, it's an educational project, and we shouldn't shrink from it.
Do you find that you have any success with students with the tyranny of merit argument?
Well, I challenge the idea. I mean, part of the tyranny of merit argument, as we've kind of touched on it here, is that those who've landed on top in our society generally have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that those who struggle or who didn't get in deserve their place too. And so it's really an argument against what I call meritocratic hubris, that the tendency to inhale too deeply of our own success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helps us on our way, and to forget our indebtedness to those who make our achievements possible. So when I invite my students to reflect on to what extent their success is their own doing rather than a measure of their good fortune and indebtedness, it leads to some lively arguments and reflections. But that's what we should be doing.
Absolutely. I'll invite you now to engage in your own lively arguments and reflections. Since we're recording this, we need to have every speaker with a microphone. So who can I call on first? There's one right there.
Erich Fromm, in his book Escape from Freedom, talks about the rise of fascism in Germany. And one of the big issues for him is anxiety. And he argues, I think, that the more complicated the number of choices entailed in a free society, the more anxious people become, and hence authoritarian. Does this in any way, do you have any thoughts about the role of anxiety in your philosophy?
Thank you for that. Anxiety does loom large in our present public life. I mean, just think about the election we just had. I mean, I imagine there may be more than a few people in this theater who at least encountered some anxiety over the past few months, not to say days and hours.
Or coming months.
I'm sorry?
Or coming months.
Well, so anxiety by itself is not a source of danger or of authoritarianism, but I would say that anxiety, if it's bound up with anger and resentment and grievance of the kind that we've been discussing, and if it's accompanied by the atomization of society, that begins to be a toxic brew. Anxiety combined with anger, grievance, resentment, and an atomized society where people feel dislocated, unmoored, not respected, and not in community, that's the source of a toxic, dangerous politics that we need to take seriously. I was struck, I read a news account some months ago looking at evangelical Christian communities who provide very strong support for Donald Trump's campaign. What struck me about the article, which was very carefully reported, was how the level of church attendance among many evangelical Christians has declined in recent years. Now, that worries me. Not because it's for me to say whether any believer attends church. That's entirely for them to decide. But if it's a marker of a growing atomization and isolation that goes along with background anxiety, anger, resentment, fear, grievance, that's something to worry about.
There's one right here. I'll go from this side to this.
Is there a set of courses that you think should be required for the university students to take, such as your own, or courses like that, including courses on the importance of participation in a religious community?
Well, I think that we should make available to all students, or maybe require of all students, some course that introduces them to moral and political philosophy, the tradition of moral and political philosophy, and that it relates it to contemporary issues. And there are lots of ways of doing such a course. And as for courses in the importance of religious community, I think there need not be a single course on that subject, but I think there should be courses that acquaint students with ongoing debates about individualism and community, the dark side and the bright side of each individualist and community traditions. This, I think, is an important part of civic education. Yeah.
Right here. And then the man right behind her.
Thank you. My question is actually very, very similar, but it has to do with why wait so long? I mean, by the time you get to university, you, in many instances, are already dealing with a level of elitism. And what happened to saying the Pledge of Allegiance in school? What happened to civics courses? It's been decades and decades. Why aren't we addressing some of these cultural issues that you talked about?
Yeah.
Why aren't we, as an American society, addressing them at a more elementary, literally, level?
Well, I think you make a very good point. We should be. It may take a somewhat different form, civic education, in primary and secondary school, but I think it's very important. I think that in the earlier years, the focus should not be on moral and political philosophy. It should be on the study of American history, the American political tradition, for example. Civics, not only from the standpoint of how government works, which can be very dry if it's detached from the stories and the debates that animated the American political and constitutional tradition. I think such courses can be taught effectively, certainly at the secondary level, and in more narrative ways, storytelling, even in primary school. So I think you make an important point. Civic education should begin early. And I would add one other thing, because I agree with you that it shouldn't only be something that happens in colleges and universities. We easily forget that most of our fellow citizens do not have four-year college degrees. Nearly two-thirds do not. So it's a mistake to simply assume that higher education is the only site for civic education. Primary and secondary schools are one important site. You raise an important point. But I would also suggest that we should have a kind of civic education that occurs outside of schools, in union halls, in religious communities. I think within the civil society, there should be venues for discussion, for reading groups, for debate. If you look at the history of the labor movement in the United States, the most significant union of the late 19th century were the Knights of Labor. And among their demands, in addition to better wages and shorter working hours, were reading rooms in factories, so that during their breaks, working people could read newspapers and magazines, inform themselves about public affairs, so that they could be better citizens, which takes us right back to the civic tradition of freedom. Civic education, not only in higher education, not only in school, but also out of doors, so to speak, in municipal centers, in town centers, in public libraries, in churches and synagogues and mosques, in labor halls and the like. I think we need a new project in civic education, broadly conceived.
Okay, we have one man here, and I want to urge you to be crisp and efficient, because we cannot go over our deadline, and I'm sure that there is more than one question.
It seems that the elites themselves in academia, media, technology, business, they need their own civic education to the extent that they are stewards of cultural and civic institutions. And it seems that one of the acids that's worn away those institutions has been the neglect of that sense of duty to preserve the institutions over and above individual desire and advancement.
Yes, and what that suggests is that civic education is not only book learning, but it's also a certain kind of practice and orientation to public life. And part of the emptiness, the hollowness of public discourse in recent decades has been that what passes for public discourse is either narrow managerial technocratic talk, which many elites engage in but which inspires no one, or when passion enters, we have shouting matches, ideological food fights in the halls of Congress or on cable television and talk radio and in social media. I think there's a great hunger for a better kind of public discourse. And we've been talking about civic education, but broadly conceived, I don't think we're going to address the discontent and even the shadow of danger that hovers over democracy today unless we find a way to revitalize our civic life and to cultivate in young people and citizens generally the ability and the confidence to reason together, to argue together with civility and mutual respect about big questions that matter.
Geoffrey, we take one last question from the front row.
Of course. Right here?
Thank you very much. Appreciate your being here. I grew up in South Carolina, in Greenville. My father was a minister of a church, and You talk about civic education in places other than schools. In his church, he didn't tell you how to vote, but that was one thing that he sort of hammered into the congregation, your civic obligation to vote.
Yeah.
And given that, I spent 4 years living in Brussels, Belgium, and Election Day is a holiday there. And in addition, everyone, it's an obligation, it's required for you to vote. And if you don't vote, you're fined. So I was wondering, and you know, it works because 98% of the electorate voted. So I just wanted to get your views on that type of system and whether you think it might work here.
I think it would be resisted here, but I would be in favor of it. And this goes to the competing conceptions of freedom with which we began. Because from the standpoint of a purely individualist notion of freedom, requiring everyone to vote is a violation of freedom. But from the standpoint of the civic tradition of freedom, it's a way of affirming and announcing that citizenship matters, and that to be a citizen is really to hold a kind of office that carries certain obligations. And one of those obligations, the most elemental, is to vote. And so I would be in favor, but compulsion alone will not be enough, which brings me to the first part of your comment, that when your father in the church was preaching that there's a duty of everyone to vote, this cultivates the values, a moral and civic rationale for voting. So it becomes more than an act of compulsion. It provides a kind of moral and civic grounding for that obligation, because what it reminds us is that certain obligations flow from the fact, which we sometimes forget, but need to recognize, we are all in this together, and democracy will only work if we take citizenship seriously. Thank you all very much. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Sandel and Geoffrey, and thank you for being such an engaged audience. I hope it's not too far-fetched to suggest that we've created a voluntary community here where we welcome people who stay the course of the 10 days as well as people who come and go, and where we do tolerate civilized discourse, civilized disagreements, and we consider different points of view. Thank you all so much. Also, thank you very much, Kay Bachman, for supporting this event. Professor Sandel will be conducted to the bookstall in a few minutes, to the Buxton bookstall, where he'll be pleased to sign some books. Thank you all, and particularly Professor Sandel and Geoffrey Harpham once again.